Hey everyone, my name is Matthew Moore, and today Group 1 will be presenting the biblical analysis that is a psychological approach to the Psalms. So, first, what even is the psychological analysis to biblical readings? Well, let me tell you, a typical psychological analysis of a reading from the Bible usually consists of an analysis of certain characters, specific authors to unique books, or even the intended audience of the Bible. With this analysis of these certain factors from the Bible, we take them and we compare those factors to different psychological theories that are known of and or are in practice today. Some of these theories consist of, or certain examples of these theories consist of Freud's theory of the mind, nature versus nurture, different personality archetypes, and most importantly, the dynamic of mental health. We get to see this all throughout the Bible, and taking the psychological approach really gets to open that up and allows us a lot of new insights to help us better understand the characters and the Bible itself.
In my part of the video, I will be talking about morals, and I'll also be talking about the superego. The superego is a part of your psyche that is sort of like your conscience. It helps you distinguish what's right and wrong, and you learn it from people over time. For an example, if you're hungry and you're walking and you see an apple pie on a shelf, you're not going to take it due to the fact that you've always known that stealing is wrong. Now, the morals from people of today are different from the morals of people back then who created the Bible, due to the fact that they're just different environments at different times. One of the examples for that could be that in the Bible it says that you're not supposed to use a certain cloth, but nowadays a lot of people really don't take that into consideration due to the fact that modern times are a lot different. So unless you're really religious, then there's people who don't really care what cloth they're using for clothes. On the other hand, some people still take some morals really serious. For an example, one of the 10 commandments in the Bible says thou shalt not kill, and that still holds up today due to the fact that people get severely punished for killing other people, and it's really looked down upon.
Brueggemann has developed a very intriguing way of categorizing the Psalms and bringing them into our own personal lives. In his book titled Praying the Psalms, he suggests that the Psalms reflect two very basic movements in everyone's life. The first is the move into the pit. It happens when our world first collapses around us and we feel that there is no way out of the pit, of the deep hole into which we have sunk into. The second is the move out of the pit into a welcome place. We suddenly understand what has happened and who had brought us up out of the pit. Brueggemann further suggests that human beings regularly find themselves in one of the three places: a place of orientation in which everything makes sense in our lives, a place of disorientation in which we feel we have sunk into the pit, and a place of new orientation in which we realize that God has lifted us out of the pit and we are in a new place full of gratitude and awareness about our lives.
Hello everybody, just going to be introducing Psalm 27 here. Although there are certain moments in the Old Testament, certainly, where Israel as a nation and certain groups within the nation are called to be the instrument of the Creator's justice, bringing the fruits of wickedness back upon the heads of those who corrupt and destroy His world and themselves, the vastly more fundamental theme is the renunciation of violent force and trust in Yahweh to fight the people's battles for them. But in a world that's filled with violent power struggles, this would mean an apparent major disadvantage for those who would not retaliate or resort to violent force. And this is a central theme of not only Psalm 27, but of the entirety of the biblical text, and that is the dependence on Yahweh for the vindication of the powerless and the oppressed. Now, the author of Psalm 27 uses the well-known story of David being surrounded on all sides by enemies that want to destroy him, both foreigners and his own people. But David's cry is that his God would see his plight and hide him away in his tent. Now, the last crucial point of interest here is the view the author has of that tent, which points to the wilderness tabernacle and later temple. The Jews saw these as miniature working models of the entire cosmos. as they also saw the garden in Genesis 2 and 3. And this is why the temple and tabernacle were decorated with scenery from a garden. Now the point is that the Israelites saw that the Creator had promised them through Abraham, and also any who would join them, the inheritance of the entire creation, the true temple of the Lord, which one day would be finished through the mission of his people, at which point he would descend to fill all creation with his presence and dwell with his people forever. For this to happen, however, death would have to be dealt with and finally defeated, and the resurrection would then be the final vindication of the Creator's people. So you can see with this kind of hope, we can better understand the psalmist's confidence that the Lord is my light and salvation, whom then shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life, of whom shall I be afraid?
So to begin, this is widely considered a psalm of orientation, specifically trusting in God, which is very true of this passage, but I feel could also be sort of categorized in a psalm of reorientation, just because there's also a lot of gratitude that is expressed, which is a characteristic of a lot of reorientation psalms. So as far as a Freudian perspective through the psychology, I would say that there seems to be some sort of inadequacy of the self that the author has, just because they are putting their trust in God to do these things instead of themselves, which, though this is true for the basis of Christianity in that people will put their trust in God because God knows best, I just wonder what this specifically says about the author as a person to himself, having to say that God is the one that can do it instead of himself. So while I see an inadequacy of the self on one hand, on the other hand, I also see an inflated ego, sort of, because the author feels that he can ask this thing of God to like let him into heaven or to shelter him from his enemies, which you can ask God for these things, but you know, how far is too far kind of thing. So there's also another aspect of this passage that I like to bring up, which Freud also talks about in his psychological theories, is this notion of the Oedipus complex, which is interesting because the author is sort of idolizing God and submitting himself to God, similarly into a fashion that the Bible explains a husband and wife should do, which is interesting because, you know, there's a lot of other places in the Bible that say that God is the husband and man is the wife, and different stuff like that. But it's also interesting on the flip side because in the passage it mentions that the author's mother and father had forsaken him, which is in direct conflict with the theory that he would, you know, search for some type of spouse like God, because God does not forsake his people.
So Psalms 34 and 56 were both written by David regarding a time when David was running away from King Saul, and he ended up getting captured in Gath by the Philistines. And both of these psalms kind of venture through what he was feeling during that time. And so he talks in 56 about how even though he's surrounded by his enemies, that he still trusts in the Lord, that the Lord will deliver him because he fears God instead of man. And in 34, he's talking about how the Lord ended up delivering him and how God protects the righteous who fear him and the wicked will be punished.
Okay guys, we're going to talk about When I'm Afraid, Fear in the Book of Psalms by Christine Jones. It's an article that explains how the Hebrew language has come to translate fear in the Old Testament, specifically looking at Psalms 34 and 56. So, as it relates to Walter Brueggemann's classification of the Psalms, Psalms 34 is considered a psalm of reorientation because it has an overall message of thanksgiving and wisdom. And so to elaborate, basically, Psalms 34, it's an acrostic poem, and it uses every letter of the Hebrew alphabet with the exception of 2, and it's quite interesting because it happens to spell out to teach in the beginning, middle, and end, which I think conveys in its structure how the psalmist intended for the readers to learn about that any bit of fear that they may have that is rationalized uses every letter of the Hebrew alphabet with the exception of 2, and it's quite interesting because it happens to spell out to teach in the beginning, middle, and end, which I think conveys in its structure how the psalmist intended for the readers to learn about that any bit of fear that they may have that is rationalized can also find relief in seeking God. And to continue, Psalms 56 is considered a psalm of disorientation because it is a psalm that combines both a cry for help and an expression of confidence in God. And so not only is it adding to the matter of relief in seeking God, but seeking to understand the truth of who He is, which in Psalms 56 is namely that God is just and we can trust in Him to judge right. Truths to be found in Psalms 34 and 56. And just overall Psalms is that trusting is equating to fearing God. And Christine Jones just expands on this as she personally takes up the position to define fearing God as a deep reverence that's founded on God's trustworthiness.
So Psalm 139 is a prayer about mental and cognitive health. In Psalm 139, God reveals to David in prayer that He is aware of all of David's thoughts and actions. David is lost. He's just trying to figure out what his flaws are, and David is revealed through prayer. Like, God reveals to David that He knows all about David's thoughts and actions, and God chooses to point out all the positive things about David and all the positive things in his life. I think a lot of us can resonate with the Psalm 139. I think we can resonate with going to that specific prayer for help and reassurance and just asking God to lead the way.
SelfConcept is the collection of ideas about how we view ourselves, basically answering the question of who am I? There are 3 perceptions of self-concept. There's the actual self, which is who we think we are and how we view ourselves. The ideal selves of who we want to be, and then the odd self is who we should be. And any inconsistencies between these 3 perceptions is known as the self-discrepancy theory. Psalm 139 basically addresses self-concept and the self-discrepancy theory. Psalm 139 begins by talking about how God knows us more than we know ourselves, shown in verse 1, you search me and you know me. Verse 3, you are familiar with all my ways. Verse 4, before a word is on my tongue, you know it completely, O Lord. Psalm 139 also talks about God knowing us before we were even born. In verse 16, your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. And Psalms 139 ends talking about kind of self-discrepancy theory and how we view ourselves in our self-concept and how God views us. Basically addressing the idea that God's concept of us is known wholly and truthfully, whereas our self-concept, there may be some holes because we do not know ourselves the way that God knows us. And it says, verse 23 says, search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me and lead me in the everlasting way. Basically asking if there's any discrepancies between my self-concept and who I actually am and who you actually know me to be. Help me to address that so that way there are no inconsistencies, but only consistencies.